In this video, we're going to be talking about why conspiracy theories are far worse than we're talking about the mysticism of the past. Now, what I mean by the mysticism of the past is basically the ideas of saying that trying to create explanations of why things actually happened. Now, we found that in the past, they would try to come up with many different odd ideas of why things happen with it, but basically when they would come up with any type of sound solution with it, eventually with it, obviously at the start with it, obviously it would be contested until obviously it would be completely pounded through and actually validly proven. And it might have taken a little bit of time to actually prove this, uh, and actually not just prove it on paper, but physically prove it. But once this would actually be physically proven, eventually the idea of the mysticism would drop, even if it would be connected to religion. Religion would eventually give way to scientific fact, and they'd find some type of meeting ground in the middle, in which religion can accept science. And we even back then we would actually find this to actually happen. It wouldn't be now where conspiracy theories actually differ is this is the actual point where instead of actually accepting the actual fact when it's actually been proven in an actual physical trial, what where conspiracy theories go is okay, even though they've actually been proven wrong, they'll use the excuse of saying, well, it means there must have been some type of cover up. And this is where conspiracy theories are actually far more dangerous. And this is where conspiracy theories are much different. And that's why, when we're talking about this, why they're far more damaging to society, because it's not allowing people to think logically, because they'll actually be willing to go further down a rabbit hole into illogical thought and think that there must be some type of bigger cover up in some area in which they're thinking this conspiracy theory is happening, and they'll go into another conspiracy theory that is even deeper, and that keeps going on. They'll keep stacking on conspiracy theories on top of each other. This is where things get very, very damaging. Case in point with it, we're seeing a lot of these things on these anti-vaxxers with it. They keep adding on more and more things on top of each other. And it really starts with the anti-vaccination stuff. It really starts with them thinking, oh, we're looking out for the best interests of the people with it. Well, the way this starts is you get basically people who are actually making erroneous posts at the start. What they're doing is they'll take, for instance, they take picture A, which is child goes in for routine procedure of something. Let's say, for instance, they go in for an upper GI exam because they're having issues with ulcers or something like potential ulcers or something like that, or something in the upper GI area with it. So they're gonna they're gonna be in a bed with it, have what it calls blood drawn with it, and things like that. They're gonna be seen in a bed with things like that, with a cuff on their arm with it. Things like this will be seen. And when it comes down to it, is what'll happen is they'll take this person, they'll take their picture. Somehow their picture will be leaked with it because maybe a family member puts it online, and it gets made posted online public, and they'll have one caption that went below it. Well, what they'll do is that person that wants to basically make this anti-vax post will take it off, and what they'll do is they'll now apply this to being that, oh, this person went in with it, they got the so-and-so vaccine, let's say Pfizer or Moderna or Johnson & Johnson, and they had they were having heart palpitations or whatever type of symptom they're trying to make up with it that never exists in these vaccines. And they're trying to basically create these symptoms that don't even exist in the vaccines. And oh, you can die from these vaccines with it. See how all these kids are getting sick, and you need to feel bad for this. Now they'll keep posting a bunch of these photos. Meanwhile, these photos are completely erroneous. And what you'll get a bunch of these users that'll be doing this. Now, the purpose of this is to get an emotional reaction on these people. They feel bad for these kids. Now, none of this stuff ever happened, and this is the whole point of the purpose with it. Is none of this stuff ever happened, but and you can look it up. But the fact is they'll make you think it did happen. Because it sounds like a concerned person about these individuals. And what you're doing it like you're actually talking about these individuals you care about, and you're trying to pass this stuff along. But what ends up happening is what you're doing deliberately is you're deliberately trying to deceive people. And these are coming many times from people that are trying to basically from groups that are trying to undermine the vaccination process, which would actually help in the health of individuals, because there is no such thing as a collective health for individuals. But it works for just the individual themselves. It doesn't matter frankly, we should not be even concerned about something like public health point with it. This is an erroneous idea. It's for the individual with it. So what they're doing is they're undermining what individuals can do for themselves, and this ends up hurting people. So what that ends up doing is that puts people at risk. And they do this to spread this conspiracy theory, and many times it's stuff from usually overseas bot farms with it that are basically people that are trying to do this to undermine the economic growth of certain industries within the nation. And they're doing it at the interest of within their country to basically further their interests around the globe, knowing that basically that if a huge number of people are dropping dead, that it's going to hinder any growth, and if there's not going to be the immigration to take those spots, this is going to be a huge problem. And especially with low birth rates in the country, this is going to be a huge issue going forward. And it's going to be a long haul to actually deal with this when you talk about potentially putting a fifth of the country at risk minimum. And that's where, when we talk about these anti-vaccine conspiracy theories, that's why. So what ends up happening is you have those with it. The same idea happens with these QAnon things. They have start basically on the idea of, they'll talk about such things like basically about child sex slavery, and they'll say that that powerful people in Hollywood and powerful people in Washington, D.C. are all responsible for this. And then they'll say somehow Donald Trump is supposed to get him out of this. Nobody actually looking into this thing realistically, actually using some logic behind it, understanding that one of the advisors for the transition team in 2016 for Donald Trump was actually a pedophile that Donald Trump has been friends with for a long time. And George Nader, and George Nader is actually currently in prison. Yet people still think Donald Trump is some sort of hero in this whole thing. Other things with this whole thing that ensnaring other people with it is that it ensnared Matt Gates in this whole probe with it. It was actually ensnaring Republicans in this whole probe. They weren't ensnaring all these Democrats, or they weren't ensnaring all of these people from Hollywood. They just ensnared basically through this whole thing. They ensnared a few Republicans and it looks like they're going to snare more down in Florida through this whole operation that was supposed to be going through. And that's basically what they're doing. So if there's anything going through with it, that's basically all that ended up happening. So if there was anything that he ended up doing with it, was basically getting rid of Trump Republicans. And it's actually those Trumpers that were actually the problem in itself with it. The MAGA movement was actually the whole problem all along. And when we start to look at it, so all these people going with this whole idea of QAnon, well, the QAnon that was attached to the MAGA movement, well, it in itself was the whole problem all along. They needed to look in the mirror. That's why when we start to look at these things with it, when you start to look at all these conspiracy theories, is when you start to break them down with it, this is why they start to prey. The whole idea on them is get the people to prey on their actual sympathy. This is why the ideas of the modern conspiracy theories are to get the people to prey on their own sympathy, because the old ideas of some of these outlandish ones just don't work anymore. The idea of saying that there's this of the racial based ones with it just don't work anymore, because people don't buy into them anymore. People don't buy into that there's some Jewish cabal of people that are trying to take over the world and create a one world government. It just doesn't work anymore, because frankly, people are actually looking a lot more logical on it, understanding that with the different political ideologies, it's not plausible. They're going to have their own interests, and they're going to be fighting against each other. They're going to be if they can't come up within one country with the way they want to actually push the needle politically, they're certainly not going to want to actually agree on anything on an international scale. We're talking from major political leaders, major military leaders, and major people when it comes down to business leaders. They're not going to agree on anything. And people are trying to say, and trying to say that this whole thing of like the bureaucracies and all those people control everything. Well, just by putting in someone new that's the same thing is not going to change anything. The only way you're ever going to change anything is actually by adopting pure capitalism. If you put in someone who is a nationalist, they don't like capitalism. This is the whole thing with these conspiracy theories. They think, oh, if we only had this with it, we just need one guy to take over everything. And this is where all these conspiracy theories tend to drive people. They always end up wanting to drive people to just put in that one guy who can change everything. No, it's not going to happen that way. The idea is to strip power from the government and actually put it into individuals. You want to actually dilute power from government as far as you can do it. And this is the only way it's going to do. This is why when you get these conspiracy theorists, they don't even know what they're talking about. And they end up being completely nuts. And when we start to look at all of these things, it ends up showing that they're even they end up going from one crazy thing to the next crazy thing to the next crazy thing. Now they're trying to basically on these COVID things, they're trying to say there's some type of magnetism. Let me show you with what that actually goes with. When we actually look at where that theory came from, the initial thing with it was there was an initial theory of how to beat COVID-19 was basically by actually reversing its actually cellular magnetism of the way it actually worked, of the actual virus in itself, of the actual virus and actually separating it from its own components, which would actually kill the virus in itself with it, and not actually allow it to function, and then actually allow it to, and actually stop its ability to join up with other cells and reproduce, and allow those cells to reproduce the virus. And so what was actually proposed was actually high doses of actual amounts of magnetism within the body. Now, this is what was actually proposed as one type of treatment. No, it was never actually applied beyond an actual theory. So this was never actually done. They went just straight with the idea of the vaccines, because this was basically a 30-year-old technology that had already been actually 30. What I mean by 30 years old, I mean 30 years old actually in play. They had already done mRNA technology already actually in usage for 30 years. So they had found that to be far more effective in actually usage. So they, instead of using something that was more experimental, they found do something that's actually been in use for a long time. The only thing that was actually changed was the ability to plug and replace. This is the only thing new with the technology. And when people try to say, oh, it's something experimental, it's not experimental. It's just basically all they're doing is to allow the thing to basically plug and replace the actual virus. So what they can do is basically take that virus, pull it in, and replace it with something new, which allows you to actually say that any pandemic that comes in the future would not be able to have any ability to have any impact, because you're going to essentially just apply the next one. They could basically, you could churn it out, you could churn the vaccines out as fast as you can actually manufacture them, as long as government does not get in the way. And that's where we're at with this. So when we look at some of the other things with like the idea of magnetism, now going back to the magnetism, now that was actually what we're talking cellular magnetism. Now that is completely different from ferromagnetism. There's different types of magnetism. Where they're getting this idea of ferromagnetism is beyond my comprehension of this. This is something in which people who have no comprehension of science are actually trying to interject into this. Ferromagnetism, which is basically the magnetism of iron-rich metals, is completely different. And they're trying to claim that that it can do any metal, which is erroneous even on its base right there with it, because it would not be able to be as people who have been vaccinated would not be able to do that. What's actually happening is the actual surface tension on the skin, basically from oils, is actually causing the oils are mixing in with the metal, causing the metal to actually be able to have something to stick onto. You can do this idea of basically like it's no different than trying to stick a spoon to your nose and get the spoon to stick. Where you get the spoon to stick for a few seconds there with it. It's no different than that. As like party trick. And this is basically no different, and this is what's actually going on with it. None of this stuff is actually legitimate. It's all basically theatrics. and what they're actually showing out in Ohio. This is a damn joke, and it should not even be allowed to actually be seen on not only a national scale, but actually be seen actually in any type of legislative body. This is basically something in which you'd probably expect something out of a third world country trying to pull this garbage off, because it doesn't even realm with anything close to science, and they're basically saying, "Oh well, I saw it on a YouTube video." I mean, that is the most insane thing. I mean, if you try to pull that one, you should basically be thrown completely out of basically your position with it. I don't care what your position is. If you come in there with it, if you're an RN, you come in with that type of garbage, and you say, "Well, I saw it on a YouTube video," and you're basically saying, "Well," or you're actually something of a doctor that gets funding for your anti-vax type of thing, or something on the same level as a doctor. You should basically, if there's any funding that you're getting from the state for any of these like PPP loans or anything like that, you should be required to pay 100% of that money back out of your pocket. Because frankly, you're basically, all you're doing is you've basically ripped off everyone, because you've been just running a scam, and basically that your company should be basically listed under the government as an actual scam company, and it should be under the Better Business Bureau should basically be listing it as an F, and listed as an actual scam that you're nothing but a snake oil salesman. Because frankly, if you're actually pulling that garbage, you should not be allowed to actually be able to practice any type of medicine. You should have your practitioner's license revoked. Because if you're going to be pulling that type of garbage out there, you should not be allowed to actually practice medicine. Because if you're not going to live in a world of fact with it, I mean, you should not be allowed in the medical community. If you're basically going to be living in some type of like snake charmers world, I mean, this is what it's relegated to. I mean, that's some type of thing of like some witch doctor would try to pull that garbage. And that's basically what it's relegating to. I'm not saying anything against that, but that's basically in the Western world with it. We live in facts, and we need to have our doctors and nurses and all of the positions like that actually produce facts. Another thing we're seeing is basically people trying to defend the idea of, when it comes down to these conspiracy theories, is the idea that if you work for a hospital, you should be able, they're saying that you shouldn't have to get a vaccine. Frankly, with it, there are, when it comes down to working in a hospital, there are qualifications for working there. And these qualifications, you need to be renewed every little bit. And these are the whole things with it. It doesn't mean you're a slave or anything like that with it. How people are trying to put this up with it. This is simple with it. My mom worked in the medical community for her whole career. The way this thing goes with it is, anytime there's a necessary vaccine, anytime there's a necessary test that needs to come up with it, sorry, when it comes down to other information, when it comes down to more education in your system, education you need to add to your repertoire, sorry, but yes, they can fire you if you do not upgrade with it. They don't technically fire doctors with it. They just remove them from the hospital group and doctor's roster. So if they refuse to comply, and this is what ends up happening, they will actually remove them. So it is technically equal to a firing. And if you refuse, they will actually boot you. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're some high-profile person. If you refuse to comply, they are going to boot you. And there is This is not some type of thing where you can say, "Oh, I'm going to sue over civil rights." No, you're not going to win, because frankly, you're stating that if it's something like a health issue, you cannot put you cannot put patients, nor can you actually put other personnel at health risk. This is not allowed. Number two, when it comes down to actually training and education, you cannot refuse that, because of the fact is there's an actual standard of what they expect for those positions. If you cannot comply for those, they're going to put someone else in there who is going to be well equipped for those positions, and they can actually remove you at any time. This is not an this is not an entitlement to those positions. This is not something like what they give you in like a public union. It does not matter what you say. Guess what? You can be fired at any time. And you're not protected from any of this stuff. And there's certain standards that you need to comply with. If you walk off the job during a pandemic, you will be fired. These are the certain laws of what ends up happening if you work a job in the medical field. And you basically, when you take the job in the medical field, you know these requirements. And anybody that ends up complaining about it, well, guess what? You knew what was coming in when you took the job. And I've heard other people say, well, I don't have any problem with vaccines. This is what we call just experimental vaccines. Guess what? This isn't experimental. The whole technology came on and has been there for over 30 years. This thing is not experimental. All they're doing is the only thing they added was a plug and replace. This thing, all they're doing is basically just using the new vaccine and the new virus in there. That's the only thing that they're changing. And they have to use the new virus with it, because otherwise it will not work. And basically what ends up has happened out there is we have a lot of people that have been complaining, basically because they think that they can actually get away with it. We have an entitled group of people, and this is basically what it is. This is where some of these conspiracy theories have been grouping around. Is we have people that have tried to use the anti-vax movement to use as an entitled thing of, well, I just don't want to do it because I think I'm entitled not to do it. Not necessarily that they're actually and they think it's a way to like own the opposition or some type of thing like that. Not necessarily if it's any type of legitimate idea, but this is where it's coming from. And they're willing to resort to going down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories to do this. And we're finding a lot of people go down this type of aisle just to actually defend it. And this is why when we compare it to the mysticism of the past, once they actually were confronted with the actual truth, and they actually found out the truth of the way of something where they actually found an option that was based on a physical test that would show them the answer, they weren't going to continue to question it. And they weren't going to keep going down that rabbit hole just to basically continue on these things. Now we got people that are willing to spite themselves and go against self-interest just for basically partisan reasons. I mean, this is not exactly where we find people acting in self-interest anymore. And this is where we've gotten people acting out of insanity now. And this is why when when we have this, we have some of the people in that, and then they're also going to be susceptible to these emotional pleas on these other conspiracy theories, and that's where you start to get to these very, very, very dark areas, and they'll try to get people to believe all these other things, and that's where you start to get these people. They're willing to commit acts of violence because they're being fed this garbage, and they're that's basically completely false and completely driven by complete falsehoods from the start, and they're being manipulated by many groups of people, and it's becoming a wider spanning circle, and they're basically trying to prey on the ideas of charity and compassion, and they're trying to take advantage of this and trying to delve into it and trying to create violence and disarray from it, and that's what you get from it. And they're trying to get them to actually attack other groups that are actually wanting to do things positive within the country, and or even just groups in general. And when you start to get these people, they're not. It's the idea of making sure that they're not thinking clearly and willing to attack anybody else who tries to present any type of argument that basically showcases any type of fact in front of them. Anytime you present them with a fact, they're going to basically retreat to their conspiracy theories and start resorting to insulting you for presenting fact, and all these other things such as that. And this is where you get to such insanity, and it's why I would say that why it gets so much worse, because when what's end up happening is you have someone kind of lighting the fire at the start of creating these false identities of what's actually happened. You get then you get these people falling for spreading all this stuff because they think it's true, and then you end up getting at the end you end up getting people, a huge group of people believing it because it's been spread. We're talking countless times, and in the end, not able to be fully debunked because you can keep stating it's false with it, but by then you've already had a bunch of people believing this garbage, and you can try to debunk it, but if you've already failed to hit it at the start and potentially shut it down, I mean, you're gonna have to get to the point of almost shutting this stuff down. And I don't want to say getting to the point of where people are going to have to start copywriting their photos with it, but we might have to get to that point unless it's used for memes. If it's not used for fair use, like such things as memes, I think that we're going to have to say that we're going to have to go to an actual thing of like, uh, unless it's used for like the idea of like memes or parody or something. I think we're going to have, or actual things of like legitimate reposting of news articles. I think you're going to have to what it called get things in which uh, they're actually people are being able to essentially uh, try to basically trademark their own photos. I mean, and this is where it's going to have to get to. And that's not something which I want to see happen, but if we're seeing people abuse this to such a degree and abuse these types of photos to such a degree that people are going to have to take photos like this and take their own photos that are potentially like this and try and make sure that no one's going to steal them and use them for their own advantage, for some type of political advantage where they think down the line that they can use it. And because this has gotten insane to be able to use them to actually spread conspiracy theories. Because we're seeing users that are actually using boatloads of them. And you can just tell with the user with it. If the user has like 100 of these, you need to you need to use your brain and say something's wrong here. And most of the time, these users aren't. These users are seeing like one story pop up with it, and they're saying, "Well, it's probably true with it." Take a look at what that actual user is doing. That user's popping up like 100 of these stories like this. That story is completely false, and this is where a lot of these other people are not taking that are falling for these conspiracy theories are not even taking a second to actually be intelligent about it, and they're not taking a step back and realizing, hey, I'm being taken for a ride on this. And that's how these conspiracy theories actually move. You can actually if you can actually get just a few people to actually think, and that's what's happening right now is we're not getting people to critically think. The idea of critical thinking is not very good, at least within this country. Maybe other countries I think are a little bit better than us, in the United States with it, but here in the United States, it's a very, very poor thing. And people might say, but previous generations were better." No, that's actually our problem. Our problem right now is that previous generations are actually very, very poor. Specifically, like the boomer generation is probably one of the worst generations out there for critical thinking when it comes to on the internet, and they fall susceptible to these things all the time. I'm not saying I'm saying like people like my parents. My parents are far more skeptical, but there's other people out there who are basically going to fall for anything out there with it, not going to be able to, not willing to actually look into stuff and actually do a little bit of research. And the reason why I say why I give my parents credit is because the way they raised me with it to be highly skeptical on things with it, to actually look for my own answers with it, not just basically take people at their word. If you take people at their word with it, I mean, you're not going to be the brightest brick in the wall. They call those people lemmings, and they're called that for a reason. Now, I'm basically going to cut it right here with it. I think we've gone about enough on the topic, and that's about it. And bye, everyone.